the day humanity erased the archives, was the day the galaxy learned darkness. The pouch was dark wax cloth, worn soft at the edges, and she set it on the table the way she always set it, left hand, flat placement, no adjustment after, while the Archlector's declaration ran to its 11th second and stopped. The Grath Ascendancy had just erased humanity's cultural archive, every document submitted under the original accession agreement, 31 years of human presence in the Thelvar Assembly, reclassified as pre-sapient record under Charter Provision 7, Clause 2, certified at 200 hours station standard, already purged from Assembly archive holdings before the morning session had finished its first item. Lyarth Kavanas picked up her thermos and poured tea. The delegates from 3 Ascendancy-aligned blocks had already filed formal acknowledgement. Others were looking at the floor of the Grand Chamber, at the pale compressed stone that had held procedural order for 200 years, as though the floor itself might have something useful to say. The human platform sat 1.8 meters below standard floor level, a procedural accommodation written 60 years ago for developing signatories, never repealed, never challenged, never discussed. From that angle, Kavanas's stillness looked like it was happening at a very great distance. She drank her tea. She slid the pouch into her left coat pocket. She buttoned her coat from the bottom, which was not how most people did it, and which nobody in the gallery had ever remarked on because it was not the sort of thing you remarked on when you were watching a civilization's cultural record get deleted. No protest, no objection, no second motion. She walked out. Her footsteps were the only sound in the chamber for the full length of it, and the chamber was long, and the sound lasted. The gallery waited for something else to happen. There was nothing else. That was the first thing they got wrong. The transmission hadn't started yet. Neither had the part that still keeps me up at night. 31 years earlier. Or rather, 31 years and one morning, if you want to be exact about it. And the people this story is about always wanted to be exact. A facility in Cape Town filed its official designation with 3 separate oversight bodies and received 3 separate approvals within the same week. Long-Range Atmospheric Modeling Station, Heron Ground Facility, Sublevel 11 through Sublevel 14, Reinforced Foundation, Independent Power Supply, Restricted Access owing to the sensitivity of atmospheric measurement equipment. Every one of those oversight bodies believed what they had been told. Kale Andrun was 67 years old, the morning Lyarth Kavanas walked out of the Thelvar Assembly Chamber. He had been 56 when the Drevon Continuity Bureau sent its last formal communication to any external government body. Before that, he had been 47 when he wrote the Bureau's founding protocol in a single sitting, in a Sublevel 11 room that smelled of fresh concrete and recycled air, on paper, because he was not going to put it in a system until he knew exactly what it said. He read it back once. He did not change anything. He folded it and put it in a steel case, and the steel case went into a drawer that he locked, and he had not needed to open that drawer since, because he had been right the first time and he knew it. Andrun filled his tea from a ceramic mug with a hairline crack in the handle, sealed with a strip of tape he had applied in year 8 and never replaced. The tape was starting to yellow. He noticed this roughly once a week and did nothing about it. In the corner of Sublevel 11's main operations room, a compact grain press unit ran through its morning cycle. Matte black casing, a dent in the lower right corner from a drop in year 4, before the flooring had been properly laid, and everything metal was always finding a reason to fall. The dent caught the fluorescent lights at a slight angle that made the unit look, to anyone who noticed it, like a piece of equipment that had decided it was furniture. Director Andrun did not run the Bureau to be comfortable. He ran the grain press because it was the one machine in Sublevel 11 that had no classified purpose, and he trusted it for exactly that reason. The loaf came out at 6:13. He set it on the cooling rack, wiped his hands on the side of his jacket, and looked at the board on the far wall. 31 years of dark indicator lights. One of them in the lower left corner was slightly warm. He had not been the one to notice. Commander Isan Farathul had pointed it out 3 days earlier, standing at Andrun's shoulder with the particular stillness she used when she had already processed something and was waiting for him to catch up. Farathul was 53, and she had spent 17 of those years embedded in the Thelvar Assembly's security apparatus at various access tiers. And she knew every one of those tiers by sound, the different tones the clearance readers made, the different weight of a door that was rated for which level. She had come back to Sublevel 11 8 months ago and had not explained why, and Andron had not asked, because she was here, and that was the part that mattered. "It's not a fault reading," she had said. "No," Andron agreed. They had both looked at the light for another moment, and then Farathul had gone back to her desk, and Andron had gone back to his tea. The Bureau's founding charter had been signed in the same week as humanity's Thelvar Assembly accession documents. Both signings happened in the same building in Geneva, 48 hours apart, by some of the same hands. One of those documents was filed publicly. One was not. Andron had been in the room for both, and he had understood at the time that the distance between them was the most important thing either document contained. Humanity had read enough galactic history to know that goodwill has a shelf life, that archives are always the first target, that the species who go into a new arrangement trusting the arrangement to protect them are the same species who later discover that the protection was written by the people it was protecting them from. The Grath Ascendancy had completed 14 prior cultural reclassifications in 200 years of procedural dominance. Andron had studied all 14. He had spent 3 years on them before the Bureau's first operational year was finished. He knew the names of the species. He knew the documents that had been used, the same accession frameworks, the same charter provisions, the same language about civilizational development thresholds and pre-sapient classification criteria. He knew that every one of those 14 species had believed their standing was protected by the agreement that was later used against them. None of them had prepared. The Bureau did not prepare a response to a reclassification. It prepared a record of the ascendancies. The Bureau team had never been large. That was a design decision, not a resource constraint. Dr. Vesathaland was 49. She had spent 6 years building the Bureau's Shadow Archive Lattice, the system that mirrored, indexed, and authenticated every document in the Grath Ascendancy's own internal record-keeping network. She had done this without ever writing down what the system's actual purpose was. The architecture existed. The documentation called it a redundant data integrity verification protocol. The documentation was not wrong about what it did. It was simply quiet about why. Specialist Sarath Unvel was 45. He had been embedded in Grath communication infrastructure for 11 years, not observing, copying, every internal communique, every suppressed reclassification note, every document in which the Ascendancy had named, in its own words, in its own filing language, under its own classification headers, what it had done to prior civilizations and why. He kept no personal notes. He had memorized everything. His desk in Sublevel 11 looked like it belonged to someone who had not fully moved in, or perhaps someone who had never fully trusted that they would stay. Lieutenant Oran Dethys was 40. He could read 9 assembly machine languages without referencing a translation key. He had never attended a formal briefing without already knowing the answer to the main question. This was not a performance. He simply did his reading before the meeting, which turned out to be a habit so rare in institutional settings that it had come, over the years, to look like a kind of low-level telepathy. Analyst Preth Kavalas was 62. He had written the Bureau's founding protocol with Andron in year 1, or rather, he had written the first section and Andron had written the rest, and then they had swapped and read each other's sections, and neither of them had changed anything because they had both been right. Kavalas had been revising the protocol ever since. He said it had never needed a structural change. He was correct. He revised it anyway each year, because the work of a protocol is to remain accurate, and remaining accurate requires attention, not invention. He was standing at his desk now, on the other side of the operations room, writing something in a small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. He wrote in it for about 3 minutes each morning, always at the same time. Andron had never asked what he wrote. Kavalas had never offered to say. This had been their arrangement for 31 years and it worked. The indicator light in the lower left corner of the board was still warm. There is a thing that happens in institutions that have held power long enough to forget what power feels like from the outside. They begin to mistake their own record-keeping for protection. They write down what they do, carefully, completely, in formal language with proper headers and authorizing signatures. And the act of writing it down becomes, in their minds, the same as the act of having been right to do it. The archive becomes the justification. The documentation becomes the defense. The Grath Ascendancy had the most complete institutional archive in the Thelvar Assembly. 200 years of procedural decisions, internal debates, efficiency projections, outcome assessments. Every reclassification event fully documented, from the initial assessment through the final certification. The language was precise. The reasoning was recorded. The signatures were real. They had never once considered that documentation cuts in both directions. Andron set his mug down and walked to the far end of the operations room, where a second door opened into a smaller space that had been, originally, a maintenance corridor, and had been converted in year 2 into something that did not have an official name and was not listed on any facility diagram. The team called it the reading room. It had a table, 4 chairs, a shelf of physical documents that were not classified because they had been published, galactic history texts, assembly charter compilations, the public record of 14 prior reclassification events, and a single photograph pinned above the shelf. The photograph showed a building, not a famous one, a transit relay station on a world that had been reclassified 80 years ago under the Ascendancy's Charter Provision 7. The species that had lived there, the Oveth, had submitted their cultural archive as required by their accession agreement. The Ascendancy had reclassified the archive as pre-sapient record. The relay station in the photograph had been demolished 11 years later, during what the Ascendancy's own records described as infrastructure reclamation following civilizational reassessment. The Oveth still existed. They had not been destroyed. They had simply been made in every formal institutional sense to not quite count. They had been waiting for this morning for 130 years. Andron looked at the photograph for a moment. He had pinned it there in year 1 and had not moved it since. He went back to the operations room, refilled his tea, and sat down. The board showed one warm light. Then, while he watched, a second one came on. Elder Thurath of Paths was 198 years old. She had been a Yenek Assembly observer for 160 of those years. In that time, she had watched 11 cycles of procedural dominance rise and consolidate, and in a few cases, slowly thin at the edges without ever fully breaking. She had filed 43 formal objections over those years. All 43 had been acknowledged. All 43 had been dismissed. She had written 3 histories of the Assembly's structural patterns and submitted them for General Archive certification. All 3 had been declined by the certification authority on technical grounds that Thurath had found on review to be procedurally valid and substantively meaningless, which was a combination she had come to recognize as the Ascendancy's preferred method of making inconvenient things disappear without leaving a visible mark. She had never stopped watching. Her quarters aboard the Yenek observer vessel Kethai's margin were small and very full. Every flat surface held either a physical document or a stack of them. The filing system was her own and made complete sense to anyone who had spent 160 years developing it, which was to say it made sense to Thurath and to no one else. She had been offered automated archival assistance 3 times and had declined all 3. "The indexing is the understanding," she told the first person who offered. She did not explain this. She assumed the explanation would come to them eventually, or it would not, and both outcomes were acceptable. She had been corresponding with Lyarth Kavanas for 8 years. Not officially. The messages moved through Specialist Unvel's secondary routing, 4 layers of dead drop protocol, shifting relay paths every 48 hours, arriving on Thurath's end in a format that looked, to any traffic monitor, like routine Yenek observer archive updates. Thurath had studied the routing architecture for 2 weeks before she trusted it. Then she had used it every time. The correspondence had begun with a single question. Thurath had spent 11 months deciding whether to send it. The question was, "Do you understand what the pattern looks like from the outside?" Kavanas had replied in 4 words, "Yes, we have read." Thurath had sat with those 4 words for a long time. They were the most specific answer she had ever received from a junior species delegate in 160 years of watching, because they did not claim more than they meant and they did not claim less. She had replied immediately, which was not her usual pace. She had written 3 sentences. She wanted to write more. She did not. Over the next 8 years, Unvel's routing carried something else between them, the Bureau's full shadow archive of human cultural documentation, not the curated accession submission, the real record, the wars and the recoveries, the periods of catastrophic institutional failure and the ways those failures had eventually resolved, the patterns across 200 years of a species that had, repeatedly, destroyed major portions of its own accumulated knowledge, and then rebuilt, imperfectly, from whatever was left. Thurath read it all. It took 11 months. She read while traveling between assembly sessions, while eating, during the long, quiet stretches of Yennek observation protocol that required presence but not active engagement. She read the way she read everything, methodically, with a notation system she had developed over a century and a half, cross-referencing and flagging, and occasionally writing a single word in the margin that meant something to her later. When she finished, she called her delegation together. The Yennek Observer delegation was 4 people. They met in Thurath's quarters, which meant standing, because there was not room for 5 chairs. She told them what she had read. She told them what she thought it meant. "These people," she said, "do not act when they are afraid. They act when they have finished counting." Her delegation noted the observation. They filed no action. Thurath had not expected them to. The filing was not the point. The point was that she had said it out loud, and now it was in the air, and she was done processing and ready to move. The first call she made was to the Belvari Compact. The Belvari were not powerful, in the assembly sense of the word. They held no procedural standing, no block seats, no certification authority. What they held was infrastructure. 28% of the Assembly's long-range data routing ran through Belvari relay systems. This was a thing that everyone who needed to send data knew, and that most people with procedural power had stopped thinking about, the way you stop thinking about the pipes in a building once you have decided the building is yours. Thurath had been thinking about the pipes for 60 years. The second call was to the Kethais Network, Archival Certification Authority. The stamps the Kethais issued were the ones that made a document legally valid inside the Assembly's record-keeping architecture. No one questioned a Kethais certification. No one had, in 140 years of the network's operation. The Kethais had never given anyone a reason to question them, and they had a very clear sense of what that reputation was worth and what it was for. The third call was to the Ovith remnant. The Ovith did not make Thurath wait. Their representative answered before the connection had fully established, which told her that they had been watching for her call the way you watch for something you have been expecting for a very long time, but were not sure would come in your lifetime. They had been pre-signed for 6 years. The agreement had been sitting in a secured Ovith archive, properly documented, properly kept, since 6 years before this morning. 130 years of waiting, and then 6 years of holding a specific document in a specific drawer. And then a morning where the archlector of the Grath Ascendancy said 11 seconds worth of words, and a woman on a platform 1.8 meters below standard floor-level poured tea. No announcement, no declaration, no ultimatum. The Fethos Accord was forth. They held neutral diplomatic observer status in the Assembly, which meant they had floor access and diplomatic immunity, and could be physically present in any Assembly facility without challenge. They were very quiet about this. They had been very quiet about it for 30 years, attending sessions, sitting in observer positions, being present and unremarkable and exactly where they needed to be. They confirmed their agreement in less than a minute. The fifth call was to the Threnek Margin, who operated communications nodes across 9 assembly machine language systems, and had, over 40 years of node operation, become fluent in the infrastructure the way a locksmith becomes fluent in a building, not by having keys, but by understanding exactly how each lock was made and why. 6 was the Varathul Passage, who routed freight and data packets across Ascendancy-adjacent space, and who had, without ever drawing attention to this fact, become one of the primary carriers of routine archive documents between assembly member systems. 7 was the Drunnen Assembly, which held legal standing in 14 assembly subsections, and had spent 12 years quietly developing expertise in Article 12 dissolution procedure, which was not a thing anyone expected to be needed, and was therefore not a thing anyone had thought to monitor. 8 was the Omesicale thread, silent observers, physical presence in every major assembly station, the kind of species that appears on attendance records and in background photographs and is never the subject of anyone's threat assessment because they have given no one a reason. 9 was the Yennik continuance itself, historical witness, coalition initiator, the ones who had made the first calls. 9 pre-signed documents, the oldest dated 19 years prior to this morning, the newest dated 6 years prior, every one of them waiting in a secured archive somewhere for a single authenticated relay pulse from Bureau Communications at Relay Juncture Sovathul. The pulse had not yet been sent. Back in Sublevel 11, Andron was watching the board. 4 lights now. The board had space for 9. Farathul came in from the secondary corridor carrying 2 cups of tea. She had made her own, and she had also made his, which was not something she did often, only on mornings where she thought he might need both hands free. She set his cup on the desk next to his old one and said nothing. Andron looked at her. Dethys routed the confirmation request through Sovathul at 4:18, she said. The first response came back at 4:41, Ovith. The second was Kethai's at 4:49. She paused. 4 beats. She had picked up the pause from Andron himself years ago and now used it without noticing. Belvari and Threnik confirmed within the same minute. What's the session scheduled for? 900. Kavanas is already at the station. She went in last night. Andron nodded slowly. He looked at the 4th light for a long time. She knows what morning it is, Farathul said. It was not a question. She's known for 8 years, Andron said. She went in because she needed to be in the room when it happened. She needed it on record that she was present. He picked up the new cup of tea, drank. The pouch, he said. Yes. Has she ever opened it in session? No. He nodded again. The grain press was running its morning cycle. The smell of it, warm, plain, ordinary, moved through Sublevel 11 the way it always did. At the same time it always did, because that was the nature of something that ran every day for 31 years. Some things become the background. Some things become the proof that a room has stayed the same while everything else changed. A 5th light came on. Andron set his mug down and walked to the board. He stood in front of it and looked at the 5 lit indicators for a moment. Then he went back to his desk, sat down and waited. In her quarters aboard the Kethai's margin, Elder Thurath of Paths was eating breakfast. A small bowl of something from the Yennik dietary stores, pale, with a mild smell, not remarkable. She had eaten the same thing most mornings for 60 years, because she had found, after extensive early life experimentation, that she thought more clearly when she was not thinking about her food. She was thinking about Lyarth Kavanas. She was thinking about the first time she had seen Kavanas on the assembly floor 23 years ago and the specific quality of her stillness. Every new delegate had a kind of stillness in those early sessions, the stillness of someone trying to learn the room. Kavanas's had been different. It was not the stillness of learning. It was the stillness of someone who had already read the room and was now simply confirming. Thurath had filed the observation and done nothing with it for 15 years. Then she had sent the question and received the reply and read 11 months of human history that confirmed what the quality of that stillness had been telling her for 15 years. She set her bowl aside. She clasped both hands behind her back, which was what she did when she was about to say something she had been holding for a long time, and she said it to the room, because there was no one in the room. Today, she said. She had been an assembly observer for 160 years. She had watched 11 procedural dominance cycles. She had filed 43 objections. She had written 3 histories that no one certified. She had been waiting for a morning that looked like this one for most of that time, without knowing exactly what it would look like when it came. It looked like a woman pouring tea. In Sublevel 11, the sixth confirmation came in at 8:32. Deadliest logged it without speaking. He was at the relay console, reading the incoming signal in the machine language it arrived in, the Varathul routing code, which was a subset of a communication architecture the Ascendancy had stopped monitoring 40 years ago on the basis that it was purely logistical traffic. It was purely logistical traffic. That was also the best possible cover for a signal you needed to move without anyone noticing. He notated the confirmation in the log. He looked at Andrun. Andrun counted 4 beats. 6 of 9, he said. Fethos just pinged, Kavalos said from the other side of the room without looking up. He was writing in his notebook. Make it 7. The board now showed 7 lights. The Drunnen confirmation came at 8:47, 8 lights. The room went quiet in a particular way, not empty quiet, but full quiet, the kind that happens when a group of people who have worked together for 31 years reach a moment they all knew was coming and find, on arrival, that there is nothing useful to say. Kavalos closed his notebook. He crossed the room slowly, the way he did everything, with the settled pace of someone who had stopped trying to hurry outcomes decades ago, and set a single sheet of paper on Andrun's desk. A handwritten list, 41 names, neatly set down in order without headers, without dates, without any notation at all, just the names. Andrun looked at it. He did not ask what it was. He knew what it was. He knew the names, every one of them, and he knew the order, because the order was the order they had been lost. And he had been carrying that order in the same place Kavalos had been carrying it for the same 31 years, without ever comparing notes. Kavalos went back to his desk. The Omisikale confirmation arrived at 9:11. 9 lights. The board, which had been dark for 31 years, was fully lit. Andrun stood up. He went to the grain press, which had just completed its cycle. He lifted the loaf out, set it on the cooling rack, and wiped his hands on his jacket. He looked at the loaf for a moment, small, dense, perfectly ordinary, the same as it was every morning. He turned to face the room. "Begin the reading," he said. Kavalos opened the protocol. Deadliest was already at the relay console. Thaland moved to the archive lattice interface without being asked. Varathul stood by the secondary door, watching the board, her arms at her sides. The grain press had finished its cycle before the transmission started. Some things you let finish what they started. The transmission had not yet started, but the board was fully lit for the first time in 31 years, and Kale Andrun was standing in Sublevel 11 with warm bread on the cooling rack and 41 names on a sheet of paper on his desk. And Lyarth Kavanos was already on her way back from the assembly chamber, and somewhere aboard the Kethai's margin, an elder who had been watching for 160 years had just said one word to an empty room. The question that nobody had answered yet was what was inside the pouch. Deadliest sent the authenticated pulse from Relay Juncture Sovathul at 9:17 station standard. It took 4 seconds to travel the distance. It looked to any traffic monitor along the way like a routine data integrity check from a Bureau of Atmospheric Modeling facility in Cape Town, which was what the routing header said it was, and the routing header was technically correct. The pulse arrived at 9 simultaneous endpoints. All 9 confirmed receipt within 30 seconds. The transmission began. It was not dramatic. That was the first thing to understand about it, and the thing the Grath Ascendancy would later, much later, in the accounts filed with bodies that no longer had authority to receive them, describe as its most troubling feature. There was no broadcast signal, no alert, no formal announcement of any kind. The documents moved through Belvari relay infrastructure, tagged with standard routing markers, and the archive format headers that Vesa Thaland had spent 3 years reverse engineering from the Ascendancy's own filing system, authenticated at every relay node by Kethai's network certification stamps that no one in assembly space had questioned in 140 years. The packets entered the normal morning data traffic flow the way any archive document enters it, quietly, in routing format, properly stamped and addressed. The delivery took 11 minutes. In Sublevel 11, Andron sat at his desk and watched the transmission log on Deathis's console. Not the content of the transmission. He had read the content already over the course of months, had read it the way a person who builds something from scratch reads the finished version of it, checking that each part was still where it was supposed to be. He watched the delivery confirmations. Each one was a single green indicator on the log. They came in clusters, then alone, then in clusters again, as the routing paths found their fastest routes through the Belvari relay architecture. Every embassy in assembly space, every council terminal, every public information node in conclave, not broadcast, delivered, one copy each, properly certified, logged as received, the way any archive document is delivered. The grain press cooling rack still held the loaf from the morning cycle. The smell had moved through the room the way it always did, settling into the corners, becoming part of the air. Andron had stopped noticing it years ago. He noticed it now, the way you notice something that has always been there when the room around it suddenly becomes very different from what it was. He looked at the list on his desk, 41 names, 2.3 million documents. That was the number Grath Ascendancy had arrived at on the last day of his 11th year embedded in Grath communication infrastructure, when he had completed the final authentication pass on the Shadow Archive and sent a single-word confirmation back to Sublevel 11 through Deathis's routing. Done. The word had arrived in the evening. Andron had been at his desk. He had read it, counted 4 beats, and gone to make tea. Now those 2.3 million documents were in transit, the Ascendancy's own records, their own language, their own classification headers, their own internal notation system for each of the 14 prior civilizations they had reclassified and purged over 200 years of procedural dominance. Every efficiency projection, every internal debate, every authorizing signature, the exact language the Ascendancy's own archivists had used to describe each case. And in the summary document for every single one, the same line, no further cultural legal standing expected to be claimed. And now a 15th case, filed 4 hours ago. Humanities fresh, completed this morning, already in the Ascendancy's own archive under the same heading, in the same format, certified by the same signatures. The last delivery confirmation landed in the log at 9:28. Deathis looked at Andron. Andron looked at the board. The board showed 9 lit indicators. The room did nothing, which was correct because there was nothing to do. The work was done. The board would do what the board would do. The assembly would receive what it had received. What happened next was not Sublevel 11's business, and it never had been. Sublevel 11's business had been the record. The record was delivered. 31 years, 41 names, 2.3 million documents. The reckoning was not a battle, it was a delivery. 40 seconds. That was how long the silence lasted across every monitored channel in assembly space between the completion of the transmission and the first response. It was not a comfortable silence. Andron would learn this later, from accounts filed by observers who had been in various assembly locations when the documents arrived. The silence had a particular quality, those accounts said, of a room in which everyone has just received the same message and is looking at everyone else to see if they also received the same message. The answer, each time, was yes. The Drunnen Assembly filed an emergency resolution under Assembly Charter Article 12 at 9:29, dissolution proceedings, directed at the Grath Ascendancy's procedural standing. The filing was clean, complete, and had clearly been drafted by someone who had spent considerable time on Article 12 dissolution procedure and wanted to get it right. The Drunnen had spent 12 years getting it right. 7 more species filed within 90 seconds. Then 23. Then the filings were arriving faster than the monitoring system could log them in sequence. And the log was switching to batch notation, and the batch numbers were climbing. 61 species, 40 seconds of silence, and then 61 Article 12 dissolution filings inside 100 minutes, from species that held legal standing in 14 assembly subsections. Aboard the Kethai's margin, Elder Thurath of Paths received the documents at 9:28 Station Standard, the same moment as every other assembly member. She was sitting at her desk. The breakfast bowl was still there, pushed to one side. She had been writing in a notation pad, one of the physical ones she used for preliminary indexing, the kind with the pale green cover that the Yenek Archival Supply Office had been producing in the same format for 80 years. The document package arrived through her standard assembly archive feed, flagged with a Kethai's network certification stamp. She opened it. She read the first summary page. The summary page was from the Ascendancy's own internal records, their own account of their own actions across 14 prior reclassification events, in their own language, with their own headers and authorizing signatures. Thureth had read external accounts of most of these events, incomplete ones, second-hand ones, the accounts the Ascendancy had allowed to survive in the General Archive, which were the accounts that made the events look procedural and routine and thoroughly unremarkable. This was the internal version. This was what the Ascendancy had written for itself, in its own archive for its own records. She read it for a long time. The notation pad was still open on the desk. The pen was in her right hand. She did not write anything. Then she set the pen down. She stood up slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has been sitting for too long and has, perhaps, been sitting for much longer than the length of this particular morning. She clasped both hands behind her back. She had been an assembly observer for 160 years. She had filed 43 formal objections. She had written 3 histories. She had spent 160 years trying to make the assembly see what she had been seeing, and watching it not quite look in the right direction. She said it to no one in the room. There it is. 2 words. She had been holding them for 160 years, more or less, and they came out quiet and level and exact, the way something comes out when you have said it inside your own head enough times that the actual saying of it is just the final step. She stood that way for a while. Then she unclasped her hands and sat back down and picked up the notation pad. She had a great deal of indexing to do. In the grand chamber of the Thelvar Assembly on Orvan Station, Archlector Uvesenthal called for an emergency floor session at 9:47. He was 2.3 meters tall, 3 jointed limbs folded inward with the controlled compression that had, for 40 years, communicated authority to every junior delegate who stood near him. His pale gray chiton was unchanged. The amber stripe along his skull ridge was a color his staff had not seen before, darker than displeasure, darker than the shade it had been when he was young, and it was pale gold, and the world had been arranged, as far as he knew, to stay that way. He called the session in formal language, which was the only language he used. Complete clauses, proper header protocol, the appropriate citation of the assembly rules governing emergency convening. He had never, in 40 years of floor service, used a personal name for a junior species delegate. He had never had to. The form was enough. The form was always enough. The Fethos Accord delegates were waiting for him. They had been in the building since the previous evening. Their diplomatic immunity and physical assembly presence had been unbroken throughout, logged, as required, with the station's observer registry in the standard format. They had attended the morning session. They had watched Kavanos place the pouch on the table. They had watched the declaration run for 11 seconds. They had watched her walk out. They were very polite. They had been present the entire time. They informed the Archlector formally that 61 member species had already initiated Article 12 dissolution proceedings against the Grath Ascendancy's procedural standing inside the Thelvar Assembly. Under Article 12, Section 4 of the Assembly's own procedural rules, a dissolution filing by a majority quorum of member species with appropriate legal standing supersedes any emergency session request by the named party. The filing was on record. The process was already running. There was nothing wrong with the form of any of it. The citations were correct. The legal standing was valid. The Kethai's certification stamps on the dissolution filings were genuine, and no one had ever questioned a Kethai's stamp. The Archlector had no procedural response available to him. He had spent 40 years inside the procedural architecture of the Thelvar Assembly. He knew every provision. He had used most of them. He had, on 8 occasions, used Charter Provision 7, Clause 2, and watched it work the way it always worked, cleanly and without challenge, because the form was correct. The form was correct this time, too. It was simply not his form. His amber stripe darkened. He was not removed. He was not expelled. He was informed, politely and formally, that it was already over. He was still standing in the grand chamber of the Thelvar assembly at Orvan Station when the process that was already over continued to run, because that is the nature of institutional process once it has properly started. It does not need you to agree. It does not need you to stop calling for sessions. It needs only the filings, and the filings were in. He did not surrender. He was not the kind of person who had ever needed to learn how. He simply became, in that hour, a person calling for sessions that no one was required to attend. Lyarth Kavanas was on a transport back to Earth. She had boarded at 8:42, before the transmission began, because there was nothing for her to do in the chamber after the morning session, and she had known that since the previous night. She had a window seat. She was reading a physical book, pages worn at the top right corner from 20 years of the same grip, the kind of book you keep, because you have read it enough times that the physical copy has become part of the record of reading it. The waxcloth pouch was in her left coat pocket. She had not opened it since the session. She did not need to yet. The pouch had been on the table at every assembly session she had attended for 9 years. She had set it with her left hand, flat placement, no adjustment after, every time. The delegates had catalogued the habit. 3 intelligence summaries she had seen described it as an eccentricity. 1 described it as a possible nervous behavior. None had guessed correctly. The transport moved through conclave space at standard transit speed. Out the window, the stars were the particular shade of not quite black that they always were from inside a transit field, a color that had no good name, and that she had spent 23 years finding peaceful rather than unsettling. She opened the book to where she had left off. She had time. 6 weeks after that morning, no human official had made a public statement, no press address, no diplomatic communique to any assembly body. The bureau went dark on all external channels. The grain press ran every morning. Sublevel 11 smelled of warm bread at 613 Station Standard, and then smelled of recycled air and old concrete for the rest of the day, the way it had always smelled for 31 years. On the morning of the 42nd day, Director Andrun walked into the operations room at 5:45, earlier than usual. He set the grain press running and then stood at the window, a narrow one, high on the wall that looked out at the Cape Town sky in the direction of the harbor, until the cycle was done. The team came in one at a time. Nobody had been told to come early. They had all arrived by 600. Farathul last from the secondary door, still in her coat. She did not take it off. Andrun lifted the loaf out of the press, set it on the rack, wiped his hands on his jacket. He turned to face the room. We did not build a response. We built a record of theirs. He did not say this. He had written it once in the margin of a document in year 14, and then crossed it out, and then left it crossed out but readable, because it seemed right to have it be readable even if it was crossed out. He picked up the list from his desk, 41 names in Kavalas's handwriting in the correct order. He began to read. He did not rush. The names were archivists, translators, embedded field operatives. Some had died in accidents, some to illness, 2 to causes that were logged as natural in the Bureau's official internal record and described in a separate section of that record with more precision, in the kind of language Andrun used when he needed to be accurate and did not want to be imprecise, but also did not want to say the thing in a way that was larger than the thing. 1 name near the end, a translator, 31 years old when she died, 14 years into her first embedding, had a Grath intelligence action in the specific detail column that had never been formally attributed. The attribution existed in the Bureau's own record, in Unvel's handwriting, with dates and routing codes, and a level of documented specificity that was, in Andrun's assessment, the most thorough single entry in 31 years of Bureau files. It had been prepared over 3 years. It had been waiting. Andrun paused at her name the same amount of time he paused at every name, long enough to hear it settle, not longer. Kavalas stood in the back of the room. He was the only one present who had been in Sublevel 11 for all 41 losses. He had counted them in the correct order every year on the same date for 31 years, in a private notation in the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. He had shown the notation to no one. He did not correct Andron. Andron had the right order. The steel plate was small, laser-etched. 41 names, the Bureau's operational date range, and a single line from the founding protocol written in year one on paper in a room that smelled of fresh concrete. A record kept in the dark is still a record. The dark does not edit. Farathul affixed it to the wall beneath the board of 9 indicator lights, which were still lit because no one had turned them off. They would stay lit. That had not been formally decided. It did not need to be. The message from Elder Thurath of Paths arrived 2 days later. Physical transmission, routed through the standard Yenek observer channel, arriving in the Bureau's receiving system with a Kethai's certification stamp that Thurath had, apparently, arranged before sending. The certification was not required for a private message. She had included it anyway. The message asked what humanity intended to do with the Grath Ascendancy's 2.3 million documents, whether they would seek deletion, whether the reckoning would include erasing the erasers. Kavanas drafted the reply herself, 3 sentences. She sent it through the Bureau's outgoing channel, which Deathis routed through Sovathul, which was now a thing they did openly, because there was no longer any operational reason not to. We will keep every document, properly catalogued and certified. The Assembly deserves to be able to read, for as long as it exists, what the Grath were. Aboard the Kethai's margin, Thurath received the reply at 11:14 station, standard on a Tuesday. She printed it. She had used a physical printer for archival purposes for 140 years. The machine was old, older than some of the species in the Assembly, and made a particular sound at the start of each print cycle that she had come to associate, over decades, with the moment a thing becomes permanent. The paper it used was heavier than standard, archival grade, the kind that holds its shape for a long time in controlled conditions. She held the printed message for a moment. Then she opened the filing cabinet behind her desk, the one on the left, second drawer from the bottom, where she kept the documents she had decided would be permanent, and she found the correct place for it. She had been a historian for 180 years. She had a clear sense of what a thing was when she held it. She labeled the folder by hand, in her own notation system, in the precise script she used for things she intended to find again. First evidence of full cycle. She filed it. Now the pouch. Kavanas opened it 6 weeks after that morning, sitting in Sublevel 11, at the same table where Andron had read the 41 names. The room was empty except for the 2 of them. The grain press was running its morning cycle. The document inside was single-page, handwritten in 2 different scripts, human and Grath, side by side, because it had been translated at the time it was made, and the original had been kept alongside the translation, the way you keep both when you know that a translation will, eventually, be challenged. The document was a Grath Ascendancy internal assessment, dated 6 years before humanity joined the Thelvar Assembly. It was not a reclassification notice. It was earlier than that, a pre-accession civilizational review, the kind the Ascendancy conducted for every new applicant species, filed in the internal archive long before the public accession process began. The document listed 11 species the Ascendancy had designated for eventual reclassification, pending accession, and a suitable window of procedural stability. Humanity was on the list, 3rd from the top. The review had been conducted before humans had signed anything, before the accession documents were filed, before the first human delegate had ever stood on a floor that was 1.8 meters below standard. Kavanas had been carrying it for 9 years. She set it on the table and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers along the left edge, which was what she did when she was putting something down that she was finished holding. She had been carrying the proof the whole time. Andron looked at the document. He looked at it for a while. He counted 4 beats before he spoke, which he did not always do anymore, only when he needed to. "How long have you had this?" "Since year 22, she said. "Unvel found it in year 19. Took 3 years to authenticate and translate. You set it on the table every session." "Yes." "And no one ever asked what was in the pouch." 3 intelligence summaries, she said. One called it a nervous behavior. Andron looked at her. "They were watching the wrong thing," he said. She picked up the document, folded it once along its original crease and put it back in the pouch. She did not put the pouch back in her pocket. She set it on the table. She left it there. The bureau was declassified 14 months later by a process that was orderly and that Kavalos supervised personally, because he had written the declassification protocol in year 6 on the assumption that they would eventually need it, and he wanted it to be right. The Sublevel 11 operations room was emptied. The board of 9 lights was removed and archived. The files went to the Assembly's General Archive, newly reformed and under a certification body that the Kethai's network now formally oversaw, because someone had to, and the Kethais had 140 years of not giving anyone a reason to question their stamps. The grain press was the last thing out. Farathul carried it herself, which she did not explain and which did not need explaining. It went into a display case in the lobby of what the building was now officially called the Drevon Continuity Bureau Historical Facility, open to the public on request. A small card was placed beside the display case. The card read, "Operational, 31 years, no classified purpose." The dent in the lower right corner caught the lobby lights at a slight angle, the same as it had always caught the Sublevel 11 fluorescence. It still looked, to anyone who noticed it, like a piece of equipment that had decided it was furniture. The card was not entirely accurate, but it was the right thing to say.